There is a version of you that you have spent your entire life trying not to become. Maybe it's the version that gets angry too easily. The version that wants too much attention. The version that feels jealous, or greedy, or weak, or cruel. You caught glimpses of it as a child, and somewhere along the way, someone, a parent, a teacher, a room full of people, looked at that part of you and made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that it was not welcome. So you did what every human being learns to do. You pushed it down. You locked it away in a room inside yourself and you stopped visiting that room. And you told yourself a much more comfortable story about who you are. Here is the strange part. That room never actually went away. It's still there, right now, underneath everything you call your personality. And what if I told you that everything you have been searching for, your purpose, your direction, the thing that would finally make your life feel like it means something, has been sitting in that locked room the entire time, waiting for you to have the courage to open the door. By the end of this, you are going to understand something most people never figure out in their whole lives, that the very parts of yourself you have rejected, hidden, and been ashamed of are not obstacles standing between you and your purpose. They are the map. You are going to learn how to actually look at your own shadow without flinching, how to tell the difference between the mask you wear for the world and the person underneath it, and, this is the part that changes everything, how the specific things you can't stand in other people are quietly pointing you toward exactly what you are here to do. So let's start where all of this actually begins. Not with some grand theory, but with a simple, uncomfortable observation about how human beings are built. From the moment you were small, you learned that not all of you was acceptable. A child doesn't arrive in the world already ashamed. Watch any toddler and you'll see the full, unfiltered range of what a human being actually is: rage, tenderness, greed, generosity, cruelty, joy, all moving through them in the space of an hour, with no shame attached to any of it. But slowly, through the reactions of the people around them, a child learns which parts get love and which parts get punished. Cry too much, and you're too sensitive. Get angry, and you're bad. Want too much, and you're selfish. Be too loud, too strange, too different, and the room goes quiet in a way that teaches you faster than any lecture ever could. And so, without ever deciding to, you built a self. Not your actual self, a curated one. A presentable one. Psychologists have a word for this presentable self, the persona. Think of it as the mask you learn to wear so the world would accept you, love you, or at least leave you alone. The persona isn't a bad thing in itself. You need some version of it to function in society, to hold a job, to be polite to strangers, to not scream every emotion you feel into every room you enter. The problem isn't that the mask exists. The problem is what happens to everything the mask doesn't have room for. Because none of it disappears. Every trait you were taught was unacceptable didn't get deleted, it got demoted. It got sent underground, into a part of the mind that exists outside your conscious awareness, but that still shapes you every single day. This underground part has a name too, the shadow. And here's what makes the shadow so easy to miss: it's not sitting there labeled, your rejected self, handle with care. It's disguised. It shows up in your life wearing other people's faces. Think about the last time someone irritated you so intensely that it felt almost personal, even though they'd barely said 2 sentences to you. Think about someone whose confidence made you want to roll your eyes, or whose neediness made your skin crawl, or whose success made something bitter rise in your chest before you even knew why. That reaction, the one that feels disproportionate, the one that lingers, the one you can't quite explain with logic, that's not really about them. That's your shadow, tapping you on the shoulder. This is one of the most useful and most uncomfortable truths about the human mind. What irritates you most in others is very often a reflection of what you have refused to acknowledge in yourself. Not always. Sometimes irritation is just irritation. But when a reaction is intense, when it's out of proportion to the situation, when you find yourself thinking about it hours later, that's usually a sign that you're not reacting to the person in front of you. You're reacting to a mirror. Consider the man who cannot stand arrogance in other people. He notices it everywhere. He can spot a hint of self-importance from across a room, and it fills him with a disgust that seems almost too strong for the moment. Now, it's entirely possible that arrogance really is unattractive. But ask yourself this: is it possible that somewhere inside this man lives a hunger to be seen, to be admired, to take up space, a hunger he was taught long ago was shameful, so he buried it, so deep that now he only recognizes it when he sees it walking around in someone else's body? His disgust isn't really about the other person's ego. It's about his own ego, the one he's not allowed to acknowledge he has. Or consider the woman who is endlessly frustrated by people who seem lazy, who don't push themselves, who settle. She built her entire identity around discipline and effort. And yet, that specific frustration, that visceral impatience with anyone who rests, it might not be about them at all. It might be about the part of her that never learned it was allowed to rest, the part of her that has been driving itself into the ground for years because somewhere she absorbed the idea that stillness equals worthlessness. Her judgment of others' laziness is the sound of her own exhausted shadow, banging on the door, asking to finally be allowed to stop. This is the uncomfortable genius of the shadow. It doesn't just hide your flaws. It hides your unmet needs, your buried gifts, your denied desires, anything you decided, consciously or not, wasn't allowed to be part of your identity. And because it's hidden from your direct view, it has to find some way to get your attention. So it projects itself outward, onto other people, where you can see it clearly enough to react to it, but safely enough to believe it has nothing to do with you. Now here is where this stops being just an interesting psychological idea and starts becoming something practical, something you can actually use. If the shadow contains everything you've rejected about yourself, then it doesn't only contain the traits you're ashamed of. It also contains talents you were told not to trust, desires you were taught to silence, and instincts you learned to distrust simply because expressing them once cost you love, safety, or belonging. A child who was mocked for being too intense about her ideas might grow into an adult who has buried a genuine passion for leading, for speaking, for taking up intellectual space, because somewhere she learned that intensity gets punished. A boy who was told he was too sensitive might grow into a man who has walled off a real gift for understanding people, for creating art, for feeling things deeply enough to translate them into something meaningful, because sensitivity, in his early world, was treated like a weakness instead of a form of perception. This is the part almost no one tells you: your shadow is not only the home of your worst impulses. It is also, very often, the home of your most authentic gifts, the ones that got exiled simply because they didn't fit the story your environment needed you to tell about yourself. So when you ask the enormous, heavy question, what is my purpose, why am I here, what am I actually supposed to be doing with this one life, you are usually looking in the wrong place. You look toward the polished, presentable parts of yourself. You look at your resume, your skills, the things people compliment you on, the safe strengths you've been allowed to show the world. But your purpose is rarely hiding in the parts of you that were always approved of. It's far more often hiding in the parts of you that were exiled, the desires you had to abandon to be accepted, the intensity you had to dim to be tolerated, the sensitivity you had to armor over to survive. This is why so many people reach a certain point in life, often in their 30s, 40s, sometimes much later, and feel a strange, disorienting restlessness, even though everything on paper looks fine. They built a life entirely out of the persona. They did everything the mask was supposed to do. And yet something feels hollow, because an entire portion of who they actually are has never been invited to participate in the life they built. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits. And eventually, usually through a crisis, a loss, a breakdown, or simply a quiet unbearable exhaustion, it demands to be let back into the room. You don't have to wait for a crisis to do this work. You can start now, deliberately, with your eyes open, instead of being dragged into it later by circumstances you didn't choose. The first step is simply learning to notice your reactions instead of just having them. Most people go through life fused with their emotional reactions, meaning, when they feel irritated, they become the irritation, they don't observe it. They just act from inside it. The shift that changes everything is learning to create a small gap between the feeling and the response. When you notice a reaction in yourself that feels bigger than the situation warrants, a flash of contempt, a wave of envy, a sudden defensiveness, instead of immediately justifying it or acting on it, pause and ask a much more interesting question. What is this reaction actually about? This single habit, practiced consistently, is one of the most powerful tools for self-understanding that exists. Because your strongest reactions are data. They are your unconscious mind sending you information in the only language it has access to: emotion, intensity, discomfort. When you feel a disproportionate charge around ambition, humility, confidence, weakness, control, freedom, order, chaos, whatever it is, that charge is worth investigating, not just discharging. The second step is learning to sit with the traits you find shameful instead of immediately disowning them. This is harder than it sounds, because our instinct, the moment we notice something unflattering in ourselves, is to either deny it entirely or punish ourselves for having it. Neither of these actually integrates it. Denial just pushes it back underground. Self-punishment just adds another layer of shame on top of the original shame, which is exactly the mechanism that created the shadow in the first place. What actually works is something closer to honest observation without cruelty. Yes, I notice envy in myself. Yes, there is a part of me that wants recognition. Yes, sometimes I feel a flicker of satisfaction at someone else's failure. These are not confessions of being a bad person. They are simply confessions of being a person. Every single human being carries the capacity for the full range of human experience, light and dark, generous and selfish, brave and cowardly. The people who seem to have no shadow are usually the people who are the least aware of theirs, and it tends to leak out sideways, in ways they don't even recognize as coming from them. There is an old piece of wisdom that fits here perfectly: the people who insist most loudly that they have no darkness in them are usually the most dangerous, precisely because they've never had to face it, manage it, or take responsibility for it. The people who have looked honestly at their own capacity for pettiness, cruelty, or selfishness tend to be gentler with others, not harsher, because they understand exactly what they're capable of, and that understanding produces humility instead of judgment. The third step, and this is where purpose actually starts to emerge, is going back through your life and identifying the moments you were told, directly or indirectly, that a part of you was too much, or not enough. Too loud. Too intense. Too emotional. Too ambitious. Too soft. Too strange. Too serious. Too dreamy. Not tough enough. Not practical enough. Not disciplined enough. Every one of these moments left a mark, and every one of these marks tells you something about a trait you bury to stay safe. And very often, not always, but often enough that it's worth taking seriously, the exact trait you had to bury is connected to the exact gift you're here to develop. The child who was told she talked too much, asked too many questions, wanted too many answers, might have buried a genuine intellectual hunger that, if reclaimed, could become teaching, writing, research, leadership, some form of work built entirely around that appetite for understanding and communicating. The child who was told he was too sensitive, who felt other people's pain like it was his own, might have buried an emotional depth that, if reclaimed, could become counseling, art, caregiving, or simply the kind of presence that makes other people feel safe enough to be honest. The buried trait, once it's found and forgiven instead of feared, doesn't stay dark forever. It transforms. This is one of the strange and beautiful mechanics of the human mind. A wound, once faced honestly, has an uncanny tendency to become a strength, often a strength that specifically serves other people who are still carrying the same wound you once had. This is why so many people who do the most meaningful work in the world are working directly out of their old pain. Not because pain is required for purpose, but because pain, once metabolized instead of avoided, becomes a very specific kind of expertise. You cannot fake having sat in the dark. But if you have actually sat in it, and found your way back out, you carry something that people who haven't been there desperately need, not advice, but proof that it's survivable. There is a discipline in this that echoes something Stoic thinkers understood a long time ago, though they use different language for it. They believe that the obstacle is very often the way, that the thing blocking your path is frequently the exact material your growth is made of, not a detour from your purpose but the raw substance of it. Applied to the inner world, this becomes something like, the trait you are most ashamed of is very often the exact material your purpose is made of, once you stop treating it as an enemy and start treating it as unfinished information. None of this means you excuse harmful behavior by calling it shadow work. Integration doesn't mean acting out every impulse. It means acknowledging the impulse exists, understanding where it came from, and choosing consciously what to do with it, instead of being unconsciously controlled by it while pretending it isn't there. A person who has integrated their anger doesn't become someone who explodes at everyone. They become someone who finally understands their own capacity for anger clearly enough to use it deliberately, as a boundary, as a form of clarity, as fuel for a fight worth having, instead of leaking it out sideways in passive aggression, or turning it inward into depression, which is often exactly what suppressed anger becomes when it has nowhere honest to go. There is a quieter, more aphoristic way to say all of this, and it might be worth sitting with. You are not broken because you contain darkness. You are only in danger when you refuse to look at it. The parts of yourself you have spent years running from are not chasing you to punish you. They are chasing you because they want to be known. And the moment you finally turn around and look at them directly, most of their power over you dissolves, not because they disappear, but because a thing that is seen clearly no longer needs to control you from the shadows. It only had power while it was hidden. This is perhaps the deepest reason people avoid this kind of inner work. Not because it's difficult, though it is, but because it requires giving up a comforting story, the story that you are simply the good, reasonable, well-intentioned person you present to the world, and that anything ugly belongs entirely to other people. Letting go of that story is disorienting. It means admitting that you contain multitudes, that you are capable of both the noble and the petty, the generous and the selfish, the wise and the foolish, sometimes within the same hour. But this admission, uncomfortable as it is also profoundly freeing. Because once you stop needing to be only the good version of yourself, you stop needing everyone around you to be only good too. You become less judgmental, not more permissive, because judgment, most of the time, is just unclaimed shadow, pointed outward. And this brings us back to purpose, because purpose was never actually about finding some external mission handed down from outside you. Purpose, more often than not, is what emerges naturally once you have stopped spending all your energy defending a false, curated version of yourself. Think about how much energy it takes to maintain a persona, to constantly monitor what you say, to suppress what you actually feel, to perform competence when you're uncertain, to perform strength when you're exhausted. All of that energy has to come from somewhere, and it comes directly out of the reserves you would otherwise use to create, to build, to contribute, to actually live. When you integrate your shadow, when you stop being at war with the parts of yourself you were taught to hide, an enormous amount of that energy becomes available again. And people who have that energy available tend to find their direction far more easily, not because purpose was hiding somewhere exotic, but because they can finally hear themselves think. So if you're searching for some large, dramatic answer to what your purpose is, consider trying something smaller and far more honest first. Go back to the traits you've spent your life managing, hiding, or apologizing for. Ask what they were trying to protect, and what they were trying to express. Notice who irritates you the most, and ask, gently, without judgment, what part of you that irritation might be defending. Notice what you envy, because envy is one of the shadow's clearest signals. You rarely envy something you don't secretly want for yourself. And when you find these buried pieces, don't rush to fix them or perform them publicly. Just acknowledge them. Let them exist. Let them be part of the whole, complicated, contradictory person you actually are, instead of the simplified, acceptable version you've been presenting. Because here is the final, quiet truth underneath all of this: wholeness was never about becoming perfect. It was about becoming complete. A person who has faced their own darkness and made peace with it is not a flawless person. They are simply a person who is no longer at war with themselves, and there is nothing more powerful than a person who has stopped fighting their own nature and started working with it instead. The room you locked away as a child is still there. It always has been. And it isn't waiting to destroy you. It's waiting to finish you, to hand you back the pieces you needed all along to become who you were actually meant to be. If this made you see yourself, or someone you know, a little differently, consider staying around for more of this. And if there's a part of yourself you've been avoiding, or a moment from your own life this brought back to the surface, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments.